The NHL trade deadline is less than 2 months away, and as usual, contending teams will be looking to add to their lineup for a deep playoff run, while teams that are outside of the playoff picture will be looking to dump off players to those contending teams in exchange for future assets like prospects and draft picks. Today, we're going to be taking a look at one of those teams that will likely be selling at the deadline. That is the Seattle Kraken. And we're going to talk about 5 players that they should trade away at the deadline this year. Let's go. Hey everybody, so today we're talking about the Seattle Kraken, who are going to be sellers at the deadline, very well out of the playoff race in the Western Conference right now at the All-Star break. And they're going to be dumping off some contracts and some movable pieces to contending teams in exchange likely for draft picks or other forms of younger assets that could help the team down the line. And I've put 5 players here on the list as we get into this that I think that the Kraken should move at the deadline this season. First on the list is defenseman Mark Giordano, and I know he's the captain of the team. He's a veteran guy and was very happy to be in Seattle, but it makes no sense for Mark Giordano to remain on the Seattle Kraken. He's in the final year of his contract. He's 38 years old. I mean, he's getting down to the end of his career where he might only have one shot at a Stanley Cup left, or maybe next season as well, possibly, but he's going to want to go to a legitimate contender, somewhere he can actually compete for a Stanley Cup before his career is over, and that is coming, unfortunately, very, very soon. Seattle is obviously not that place. He's in the last year of his deal. He's making $6.75 million this year, but Seattle would almost certainly retain salary on that if any trade was made, and Seattle's nowhere near the salary cap, and it would only be for this year anyway, so there'd be no cap issues there with Seattle retaining salary. Giordano is a guy that should go somewhere where he has a chance to go for a cup, and he's not a number 1 defenseman anymore, but he can still be a top 4 guy. Just a team that immediately comes to mind for me is the Pittsburgh Penguins. I think he'd be a really solid addition to the blue line of the Pittsburgh Penguins as they gear up for a playoff run. Obviously, there are other great playoff teams as well that could use Giordano, but Pittsburgh was the first one that comes to mind. I just think he should go somewhere before he has to retire, where he has one last shot at a cup. And also, he's a free agent at the end of the year, so he's probably not going to sign back with Seattle anyway. You might as well get something for him. Next on the list is forward Calle Jarnkrok. This is another guy in the last year of his contract, probably not going to sign back with Seattle anyway, so you might as well get something while you can. He's 30 years old. He's on a fairly cheap deal. 1 year, $2 million this season, so a very affordable contract here. And Jarnkrok is exactly the kind of guy that playoff teams want to add at the deadline. He's very versatile. You can play him down the middle. You can play him on the wing. He can play a middle 6 role. He can play a bottom 6 role. You can move him all over the lineup, try him on different line combinations, and he's just a really solid secondary scorer. He hasn't put up huge numbers this year, but Seattle isn't an overly offensive team. He's still a guy that can chip in offensively, and especially with a good lineup around him, give you some quality production in a third-line type role. And again, that's exactly the kind of player that playoff teams are looking to add to their third line before a playoff run. I think it's very likely Jarnkrok ends up somewhere else at the deadline, and I think there will be a lot of playoff teams inquiring about possibly adding him. Very, very similar situation with forward Marcus Johansen. Almost everything I said about Jarnkrok can be applied to Marcus Johansen. He's a year older at 31 years old, but also on a very cheap 1-year deal, $1.5 million. in the final year of his contract, so he's going to be a free agent at the end of the year anyway. It makes sense for Seattle to move him because you might as well get something for him rather than him just walking for nothing in free agency. And Johansen's another guy very similar to Järnkrok that's a very versatile forward, probably best suited for a third-line role, but you can move him around the lineup. He can play down the middle. He can play on the wing. He can play in your second line, your third line, your fourth line. You're very versatile and movable throughout the lineup. And teams like that, especially when they're adding a depth player at the deadline. And again, he provides secondary scoring that playoff teams are going to be looking for. So I very much would expect him to be getting a lot of the same kind of attention as Calle Järnkrok. Forward Riley Sheahan is next on the list. 30 years old, fourth line guy, a 1-year contract, $850K, very, very cheap contract. And he's just would be like a fourth line depth addition. But I do think that teams heading into the postseason want those kinds of guys. And we've seen that in the past with guys like Nate Thompson being traded, Derek Grant being traded, Trevor Lewis, guys like that, those fourth line veteran players that have been around the league and have some experience are always sought after at the deadline, not as some big blockbuster move, but just as depth additions. Teams want not just their regular 12 forwards to be ready to go for the playoffs, but they want a 13th forward, a 14th forward, even a 15th forward that is NHL ready and reliable at the NHL level for a playoff run, because that way, as guys get injured and they have guys coming in and out of the lineup, they have players that they can plug in a depth role and can actually trust and be reliable in that role. And Riley Sheahan is exactly one of those types of guys. He can play on your fourth line. He can be an extra forward, who 13th or 14th forward. He can play center or left wing. And he's a veteran guy who's been around the league for quite a while now. And again, just I think a depth addition that would definitely benefit a playoff team looking to add to their fourth line depth and go on some sort of deep run this year in the postseason. So I would definitely expect him to be moved as well. And finally, the last one, and this is the only one who's not an upcoming free agent, and that is right wing Jonas Donskoi. 29 years old, 2 years left on, 1 year beyond this year left on his contract, and a $3.9 million cap hit for Donskoi. Now, that is a little high, but again, I think Seattle would be comfortable retaining money because they're not really that close to the cap at all, so retaining a little bit of salary. If they take $1 million off of that contract and, then it becomes $2.9 million, much more manageable for a contending team that's close to the cap. And Donskoi still can provide some really solid depth scoring, and it wouldn't just be a rental either, so that would up the return for Seattle because they're not just getting Jonas Donskoi for 2 months, they're getting Jonas Donskoi for next year as well, so that would up the return for the Seattle Kraken. And Donskoi has proven to be a very solid secondary scorer throughout his career. He only has 1 goal this year, which is kind of odd because usually he scores a lot more than that, but he does have 14 assists. So he still has 15 points total, and he's been a pretty consistent 30-point guy for the last number of years. Again, going to a more offensive, better team than Seattle, you might see his offensive numbers bump up. And he's just a great guy that you can add to your third or fourth line and provide some secondary scoring to try and go down the stretch and into the playoffs for any of those contending teams. So Donskoi is definitely a guy that I think would be sought after at the deadline. And having the extra year on his contract as well makes him more valuable, meaning that Seattle can get more in return. So I think it would make a lot of sense for them to move Jonas Donskoi as well. But all of these guys are guys that can provide value. A lot of them are kind of secondary scorers. Giordano, obviously a veteran D-man who can still provide value on the back end and probably wants to go for a cup in what's probably either his last or second to last NHL season. And then Riley Sheahan is just a fourth-line depth guy. But these are all guys that Seattle should move at the deadline this year. They are guys that they can either get a pick back in return for or maybe a prospect from another team. I don't think any of them are going to fetch huge returns. None of these would really be blockbuster deals, but they would definitely be guys that Seattle could get something in return for. And a lot of them, 4 out of the 5 are pending free agents who they would probably just lose for nothing anyway, so you might as well get something. And they could all provide depth value for any team heading into the playoffs who wants to try and go on a deep run. So those are 5 players from the Seattle Kraken that I think they should trade at the deadline this year and get something in return for. And they will also have trade value. Like, these are guys that other teams will want to trade for and will have a role for on their teams as they get ready for a playoff run. So I'm going to be doing these for a bunch of different teams, but I just started with Seattle. And hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Please don't forget to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe. Follow on social media. All those links are down in the description. If you'd like to further support the channel, the links to our merchandise store, memberships, and donation link are down in the description as well. Keep spreading the word about this channel. Let's keep this thing growing. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll talk to you guys soon.